The most dangerous object in global politics right now is not a missile. It is not an aircraft carrier. It is not the Oreshnik that struck Bilit-Serkva 9 days ago at Mach 10 in a demonstration involving a nuclear-capable hypersonic system that current air defense networks cannot stop. It is not the Fateh 110 that destroyed 2 MQ-9 Reapers at Ali al-Salem Air Base 3 days ago. It is not the Hellfire missile that entered the engine compartment of the MV Lean Star 2 days ago. It is roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, buried beneath debris in central Iran. That is the core of the entire confrontation. 12 days ago, this material was described as part of a largely negotiated memorandum of understanding. During Memorial Day weekend, 9 world leaders reportedly gave simultaneous support after President Trump spoke with them, and Iran's pragmatic faction was said to have accepted addressing the issue within Tehran's framework and principle. Yet on June 2, 2026, the material remained beneath rubble in central Iran. Last Friday, the President of the United States entered the Situation Room for what he called a final determination. He remained there for 2 hours. When he emerged, no public explanation of his decision was provided. 12 days have passed since the agreement was described as largely negotiated. 2 hours of closed-door deliberation produced no signature. This morning, the IRGC continues launching attacks. Kuwait activated its air defenses yesterday. The MV Lean Star remains adrift in the Gulf of Oman with a Hellfire missile lodged in its engine room. The blockade has disabled 5 vessels and forced 116 others to change course. The agreement that was expected to prevent all of this still has not been signed. Before negotiations transformed into open conflict, a former United States Special Envoy to Iran summarized the issue in direct terms. And Iran possessing a nuclear weapon was not, in his view, a danger to be managed. It was a danger that had to be prevented. On June 2, 2026, that position is focused on one specific object. The same object that the envoy considered impossible to reconcile remains in place, and efforts to prevent the risk have encountered a reality more difficult than the language of a largely negotiated agreement anticipated. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% actually represents. The term uranium often obscures the real issue, yet that issue explains why a largely negotiated agreement remains unsigned 12 days after being presented to 9 world leaders for endorsement. Under the 2015 JCPOA, Iran accepted a ceiling of 3.67% enrichment and agreed to keep its uranium stockpile below 300 kilograms. 3.67% enrichment is reactor fuel. The figure was deliberately chosen. It allows civilian nuclear reactors to operate while remaining unsuitable for weapons development. The 300-kilogram restriction served a similar purpose. It was a quantity considered too small to sustain a realistic weapons program regardless of enrichment capabilities. By early June of 2025, the IAEA verified that Iran possessed more than 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. That figure requires context. The gap between 3.67% and 60% is not a minor deviation within a civilian program. No civilian energy system requires uranium enriched to 60%. Hospitals do not need it. Factories do not need it. 60% is widely regarded as the stage reached when only a relatively short technical effort remains before weapons-grade enrichment. Experts studying the issue indicate that Iran would likely need to raise the material to roughly 90% purity and convert it into metal before it could serve as the core of an operational nuclear warhead. The calculation that drives urgency in these negotiations centers on that final step. According to assessments commonly cited within the arms control community, moving from the existing 60% stockpile to weapons-grade material would require only about 1% of the total enrichment effort already completed. 1%. 99% of the enrichment work has already been accomplished. Operation Epic Fury and the earlier Midnight Hammer operation inflicted major damage on the centrifuge networks responsible for that work. However, the enriched material still exists. The scientific expertise remains. The personnel who operated the program remain. The directive from the Supreme Leader preventing removal of the material from Iran also remains. This is the reality surrounding the largely negotiated agreement. It is the central issue around which every ceasefire extension, every Pakistani mediation effort, every Qatari diplomatic channel, and every truth social message describing a deal as close has revolved without resolution. The United States wants the highly enriched uranium removed from Iran entirely. The preferred outcome is transfer to the United States for destruction or disposal elsewhere under arrangements that American officials can independently verify. Removed, not diluted, not monitored. Gone. Iran has advocated a different approach known as downblending. That process involves chemically reducing the concentration of the 60% uranium until it no longer possesses practical value for weapons production, while remaining inside Iran under Iranian control. The science behind downblending is not disputed. It is a legitimate technical method capable of reducing the weapon's usefulness of enriched uranium. The dispute is strategic rather than chemical. Both downblending and removal can theoretically eliminate the immediate nuclear risk. The disagreement concerns control. If the material leaves Iran, Tehran gives up something that cannot be quietly restored. The stockpile would no longer be on Iranian territory. Any future attempt to rebuild it would require recreating the enrichment process from the beginning under international observation. That concept of verifiable performance formed the basis of the former Envoy's framework. Concessions would be linked to measurable milestones that could be independently confirmed. If downblending occurs inside Iran, the infrastructure remains. The material changes. The system survives. The scientists remain. The centrifuges remain. Decades of technical expertise remain. The capacity to enrich again remains. If an agreement later collapses, if relations deteriorate, or if an IRGC commander determines that the leverage provided by the program outweighs diplomatic costs, the capability still exists. Uranium can be diluted. The ability to enrich it again cannot be diluted. Everyone involved in the negotiations understands this distinction. Pakistani intermediaries carrying draft proposals understand it. Qatari diplomats managing side-channel discussions understand it. State Department officials briefing senators on narrowing differences understand it. Representatives of Iran's pragmatic faction communicating through back channels with IRGC hardliners understand it. That is why a question that appears technical on the surface, domestic disposal versus foreign removal, has stalled an agreement capable of ending a war and potentially lowering Brent crude prices enough that American families would no longer calculate fuel costs before deciding whether a trip is affordable. The location of the stockpile adds another layer. The material is believed to be at the Isfahan site. That facility was struck by Tomahawk missiles during the earlier Midnight Hammer operation last June. The attack buried the uranium beneath the remains of the structure that had housed it. Current assessments indicate the material is still there. Since Iran ended all IAEA access on February 28th, no international inspector has independently confirmed its condition. President Trump described the surveillance environment publicly. According to his account, the site remains under constant United States monitoring. If anyone approaches it, American forces would know who they are and would respond with lethal force if necessary. He also suggested a slower approach involving cooperation with Iran, excavation using heavy equipment, recovery of the stockpile, and joint management of the issue. Tehran quickly rejected that proposal. As of June 2, 2026, the world's most strategically important nuclear material occupies a unique position. It remains beneath rubble at Isfahan. It is watched continuously through United States Space Force surveillance. Neither side has physically accessed it since the strikes that buried it. Iran insists the material will not leave the country. The United States maintains that any agreement requires its removal or its verified neutralization under conditions Washington can independently confirm. The Situation Room meeting last Friday ended after 2 hours without a public decision. Military planners in the United States have reportedly prepared options involving direct strikes against the stockpile itself. Those plans exist as an alternative to negotiated removal. Such an attack would destroy the enrichment infrastructure. What remains uncertain is the effect on the uranium. A precision strike against buried enriched material could potentially create a dispersal event, carrying radiological consequences for nearby civilian populations, agricultural areas, and water resources. That risk is what makes the option more complex than the headline description suggests. President Trump has not authorized such a strike. He has also not ruled it out. The same stockpile remains listed among the options reviewed by the targeting committee alongside the ongoing Situation Room discussions surrounding an agreement described as largely negotiated but still lacking a signature. Now step back and look at the oil market. This is where the strategic dispute over nuclear material becomes a daily economic reality. It affects every American standing at a gas pump. It affects airlines calculating fuel surcharges. It affects consumers paying higher costs throughout supply chains whenever the world's most important oil passage is effectively shut down. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of globally traded oil, one narrow waterway, 1/5 of the world's crude supply. When the conflict began on February 28th and the IRGC announced that the strait was closed to nations it considered unfriendly, markets reacted exactly as supply and demand mathematics would predict when 20% of global oil availability is suddenly placed at risk. By late March 2026, Brent crude climbed beyond $111 per barrel, reaching its highest level since the summer of 2022. At one point, it moved above $113 compared with pre-war levels. During the first weeks of the war, prices surged by more than 50%. That increase was not merely a statistic discussed by analysts. It represented the difference between paying $40 to fill a tank and paying $60. That increase then spread through every transported product, every airline fare, every industrial expense, and every manufacturing operation dependent on energy or shipping. Then the trend changed direction. In May 2026, Brent crude recorded its largest monthly decline in 6 years, dropping by more than 19%. It was the weakest month since March 2020, when pandemic-related shutdowns crushed demand across the global economy. This time, the movement was tied to expectations rather than collapsing consumption. Prices fell roughly 20% from their 2026 peaks as traders became increasingly convinced that the largely negotiated agreement would soon become official, and that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen within weeks under its provisions. By the end of May, West Texas Intermediate settled near $87, while Brent closed around $92. The energy market began pricing in peace before peace actually existed. When Trump dismissed Iran's counterproposal in mid-May as garbage and described the ceasefire as being on life support, Brent crude moved back above $100. WTI climbed above $92. Later, when he stated that the agreement was largely negotiated and that details would soon be announced, Brent fell more than 5% during a single trading session. Billions of dollars in market value shifted based on the tone of a Truth Social post. The oil market has effectively become a continuous vote on one question. Do investors believe an agreement is real and close to completion, or do they believe another wave of missile attacks is more likely than another round of diplomatic progress? That volatility is the financial expression of the 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Not because traders are monitoring rubble at Isfahan directly, rather because markets understand that the signature needed to reopen Hormuz, reduce oil prices, and restore the insurance ratings required for tanker operations depends entirely on solving the uranium issue left unresolved after last Friday's Situation Room meeting. The chief executive of Saudi Aramco outlined the timeline that energy markets are now watching. If the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked beyond mid-June, the oil market is not expected to normalize until 2027, not later this year, not later this summer, 2027. Mid-June is only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks from the point that one of the most influential figures in global oil production says separates a solution during 2026 from a longer-term supply crisis. The IEA has already begun addressing the problem through the release of 400 million barrels from emergency reserves. However, that measure cannot continue indefinitely at a pace capable of offsetting the loss created when 20% of the world's primary oil corridor remains closed. A senior market advisor summarized the situation directly. Even if Hormuz reopens, operations are likely to resume only partially. Significant damage has affected refineries and pipeline networks throughout the Gulf. Inventories have been depleted, security concerns for tanker traffic remain. Reopening the waterway and restoring commercial insurance certification does not instantly return traffic volumes to pre-war levels. Infrastructure damage remains. Mine clearing operations continue. Insurers still apply additional risk costs to routes where ballistic missiles struck military facilities as recently as 3 days ago. These are supply constraints that a signed agreement cannot erase overnight. Understanding why the agreement remains incomplete despite being largely negotiated requires examining the obstacles that continue blocking final approval. The uranium issue remains the first obstacle. It is the central pillar supporting the entire dispute. Remove it from Iran or dilute it where it currently sits. Who controls it afterward? That question cannot be solved through wording alone. It requires a physical decision involving a specific amount of material at a specific location. Money forms the second obstacle. It exists as a separate knot inside the broader problem. Through intermediaries, Iran has indicated a willingness to discuss its nuclear program, including the highly enriched uranium stockpile, but only if Washington follows through with sanctions relief and releases frozen Iranian assets during the 60-day negotiation period. Trust, therefore, must move in both directions at the same time. Neither side possesses much trust after 3 months of military strikes, 6 missile barge attacks against Gulf partner territory, 5 ships disabled by Hellfire missiles, and another ceasefire violation carried out by the IRGC 3 days ago at Ali al-Salem. The concurrent sequencing mechanism inside the Tehran framework was specifically created to address that lack of confidence. Transfer of uranium and easing of sanctions occur simultaneously. Both actions are verified through the same IAEA monitoring process that confirms the transfer is actually taking place, rather than merely being promised. This structure differs from the JCPOA. Under the earlier arrangement, relief came first and verification followed later. Supporters of the current framework view concurrent sequencing as a more sophisticated legal and technical design. It is also the feature that faces the strongest resistance from the IRGC hardline faction. Under concurrent sequencing, every delay in uranium transfer automatically delays sanctions relief. That creates direct friction with economic interests represented by rivals within the pragmatic camp, who have argued that sanctions relief is an existential requirement. Domestic politics inside the United States create the third obstacle. Its impact is surprisingly personal despite producing consequences on a geopolitical scale. Trump faces pressure from Iran hawks within his own party. Those voices oppose any agreement that fails to settle the nuclear issue immediately and permanently. The war divided the America First coalition that helped bring him to office. One faction argues that involvement in the conflict violates the promises that built the electoral coalition. The other faction argues that Iran's nuclear program represents exactly the type of existential danger that justified military action, and that any agreement short of complete dismantlement merely creates another version of the JCPOA destined to fail. Trump's own messaging has complicated matters further. This week, he stated that American forces had actually left the Iranian military alone. That statement directly conflicted with weeks of earlier claims that the campaign had devastated Iran's military capabilities. When a president presents different descriptions of the same war within the same week, negotiators meeting in Pakistani diplomatic offices struggle to determine which version of American policy reflects reality. Are they negotiating with a president who believes 85% of Iran's military-industrial capacity has already been destroyed, and who is prepared to eliminate the remainder if talks fail? Or are they negotiating with a president who believes the military was largely left untouched and who seeks an exit strategy? The answer changes what terms Tehran may consider acceptable. The fourth obstacle is the one that causes the greatest concern among analysts following the issue. It remains unclear whether anyone fully controls the Iranian side of the negotiations. President Pashkian has reportedly suggested that no major decision moves forward without Mojtaba's approval. The individual constitutionally expected to provide that approval has not appeared publicly since the compound strike of February 28th. That attack killed his father and reportedly wounded him shortly before the missiles arrived after he had left the compound for a walk. 3 months have passed without a public appearance. For 3 months, governance has reportedly operated through intermediaries. AI-generated social media content has circulated, while many Iranians openly question its authenticity on Telegram channels, despite continuing internet restrictions. The result is a unique institutional situation. Authority is claimed in the name of a supreme leader position. Yet the figure associated with that authority remains unseen. Negotiators are attempting to settle the future of a nuclear program while dealing with a government undergoing transition, operating under attack, and relying on a final decision-maker who has remained out of public view for 93 days, while recovering from injuries reportedly sustained during the opening strike of the same war now under negotiation. That is not a situation that lends itself to a simple resolution. The current situation is defined by a specific institutional opacity. That opacity allows the pragmatic faction to negotiate frameworks while the hardline faction can simultaneously weaken those efforts through military actions that violate the ceasefire and showcase continued operational capability. One analyst summarized the situation in terms that captured its contradiction perfectly. What exists today is a ceasefire where the fighting has not stopped and a peace agreement that is neither peace nor agreement. Military actions continue on both sides. Blockade enforcement remains active through Hellfire missile strikes. Iran continues launching Fateh 110 missiles toward American facilities in Kuwait. CENTCOM continues targeting ground control facilities on Keshem Island and radar sites at Gorik. Kuwait activated its air defense systems yesterday. The MV Lean Star remains adrift. Iran shot down a drone over international waters on Saturday. This is the environment in which the ceasefire, the same ceasefire, the proposed agreement seeks to extend by 60 days, is supposedly operating. The FIFA World Cup element deserves attention because it highlights an incentive structure that could produce a signed agreement during the next 2 weeks without actually resolving the issue the agreement is meant to address. The 60-day period proposed by Tehran would conveniently extend beyond the World Cup schedule. Iran is set to play all 3 group stage matches on United States territory. A 2-month pause would buy time. It would allow the tournament to proceed. It would permit oil prices to stabilize near the $87 to $92 range established by trading activity at the end of May. Most importantly, it would postpone the central question, the uranium issue, the foundational obstacle, into a second phase that may or may not achieve the resolution deferred during Phase 1. 60 days of extended ceasefire, 60 days of sanctions relief beginning to move, 60 days of mine-clearing activity in the Strait of Hormuz, creating secure routes approved by insurance providers, 60 days of energy markets adjusting to the expectation that the ceasefire will continue. Then, day 61 arrives. The uranium issue returns. The difference is that American military leverage is reduced because a ceasefire is officially in effect. The domestic political cost of resuming strikes becomes greater because a peace narrative has already been established. At the same time, the IRGC hardline faction gains 60 additional days during which reconstruction and recovery efforts continue under the protection of the ceasefire period. This is the distinction between a temporary agreement and a lasting one. Financial markets cannot accurately price that difference because markets focus primarily on the next 60 days. A temporary agreement and a durable agreement generate the same oil price outcome during that period. Their paths separate on day 61. The former special envoy designed his framework specifically to prevent a temporary arrangement from being mistaken for a lasting solution. Negotiate if necessary. But construct the agreement around verification. Build it around actions that can be physically confirmed. The reason for creating extensive systems of inspection and proof is straightforward. The consequence of verification failure is not merely a difficult quarter or an uncomfortable summit meeting. The consequence is a nuclear-armed state that has spent 4 decades using instability as a strategic instrument. Once weaponization occurs, no sanctions package can reverse it. The option of downblending inside Iran does not eliminate that possibility. It merely postpones it. The material changes chemically, the program remains, the centrifuges continue operating. The scientists remain available. The expertise accumulated through 40 years of investment remains embedded inside the institutions that created it. If a future agreement collapses, and if political conditions change in the same manner, Middle Eastern political conditions have repeatedly changed in the past. Re-enrichment from downblended material could occur on a timeline measured in months rather than years. That is the specific danger the former envoy described as irreversible. Not the risk of negotiating poorly, not the risk of misunderstanding intentions, the risk of making a single verification mistake and discovering that the one error that could not be undone has already happened. Watch the language carefully. If, during the next 2 weeks, official wording shifts from removing the material from Iran to downblending it inside Iran, that change in wording becomes the entire story. It reveals whether Washington accepted a temporary arrangement instead of holding out for a durable one. Watch Brent crude as the market approaches the mid-June threshold identified by the Saudi Aramco chief executive. Brent stands at $92 today. If it reaches $117 within 2 weeks, the market will have concluded that negotiations failed and military operations resumed. If it moves toward $80, the market will have concluded that an agreement was signed and that Hormuz is reopening. The price at that moment becomes the market's verdict. Watch for a public appearance by Mojtaba Khamenei. A government that presents its decision-maker is a government that has made a decision. A government that continues keeping him out of sight is a government still debating internally. 3 months have passed without a public appearance. If the next 2 weeks produce one, confidence in the agreement increases. If AI-generated posts continue and state television still relies on intermediaries reading statements on his behalf, then institutional divisions remain, and the negotiating position of the pragmatic faction remains challenged by hardline authority. Watch the military activity. The United States described operations in southern Iran during the past week as defensive. Tehran responded by striking Kuwait with a Fateh 110 missile that destroyed 2 MQ-9 Reapers and injured 5 American service members, a ceasefire that still produces missile attacks against American assets, and a blockade that still produces Hellfire strikes against commercial vessels. Is a ceasefire capable of becoming full-scale conflict again before the ink on any signed agreement has dried? Meanwhile, the petroleum engineering clock continues moving. It does not stop for diplomacy. It does not stop for situation room discussions. It does not stop for language describing an agreement as largely negotiated. It does not stop for the 60-day extension proposed by Tehran. Storage capacity at the Karg Island terminal is approaching critical levels and continues filling. The threshold for irreversible production losses is drawing closer. The physics governing oil wells and aging infrastructure do not negotiate. If an agreement is signed before the mid-June petroleum threshold arrives, the uranium issue moves into phase 2. A temporary deal would still generate lower oil prices. It would still reopen Hormuz. It would still create a narrative of resolution. But the question of what happens to 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% beneath the rubble at Isfahan would simply be transferred into a more difficult negotiation beginning on day 61. If the agreement is not signed before that threshold, the petroleum engineering timeline may force production shutdowns that eliminate recovery options the agreement was intended to preserve. At that point, the pragmatic faction loses its strongest institutional argument. Its argument has been that the economic terms of a deal remain survivable while the alternatives become increasingly dangerous. Once the wells are shut in, that argument weakens significantly. Within the IRGC hardline faction, one prediction continues to be tested. That prediction is that domestic political pressure inside the United States will force concessions before the petroleum clock expires. That assumption now confronts a specific American political reality. Gasoline at $4.36 per gallon. An unsigned agreement that leaves the nuclear issue unresolved creates one political environment. $4.36 per gallon fuel combined with renewed military strikes creates another. The next 2 weeks will not answer a simple question about peace or war. That binary approach misses the true range of possibilities. The spectrum stretches from a temporary agreement that halts the fighting, reopens Hormuz, pushes oil toward $80, and leaves Iran with the ability to rebuild capability, to a durable agreement that stops the conflict, reopens Hormuz, pushes oil toward $80, and removes the material under physical verification that prevents rebuilding, to renewed military operations that produce neither outcome and extend the Saudi Aramco chief executive's 2027 market normalization forecast even further into the future. Markets cannot accurately distinguish between a temporary agreement and a durable one. They only price the next 60 days. Both agreements generate the same Brent crude reaction on the day they are signed. The difference emerges on day 61. The former envoy warned of this before the conflict began. This is the mistake that cannot be reversed. Once the material becomes weaponized, no sanctions package can undo the result. The 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% beneath rubble at Isfahan remains like a suspended bell striker. The bell has not sounded. Not yet. The site remains under Space Force surveillance capable of identifying individuals and targeting them if necessary. The material remains buried beneath debris created by the strike that was intended to eliminate the threat, but instead left it entombed. Last Friday's Situation Room meeting lasted 2 hours. No decision was announced afterward. The bell remains silent. The largely negotiated agreement remains unsigned. The ceasefire in which fighting continues still produces missile launches and hellfire attacks against engine rooms at the same time. Mid-June is 2 weeks away. Time continues moving. The material remains where it is. And the question that ultimately determines whether this agreement has lasting value remains the same question that has gone unanswered throughout 12 days of largely negotiated status. Who controls the material when this ends? Will it be shipped out, or will it be downblended where it sits? Those words define the difference between a temporary agreement that ends a war and a durable agreement that removes the risk. Watch carefully for which words appear when the silence surrounding last Friday's Situation Room meeting finally gives way to an announcement. If you found this analysis valuable, follow for more in-depth coverage of military, geopolitical, and global strategic developments. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.